Hi, I'm Shawn Thomas, recently retired Southern Baptist pastor, here to share an overview with you of Lifeway's Explore the Bible lesson of Leviticus chapter 26, verses 1 through 13, with the title of Holy Living for Sunday, February 23rd, 2025. One way that you could begin this lesson would be to ask your group, when you think of a holy person, what is it you think of? What picture comes to your mind? Some might think of a hermit clothed in camel's hair, seeking God on his face in a remote desert cave, or a Pharisee in his holy robes looking down on people around him. My wife Cheryl said she thinks of somebody who's too religious to wear makeup. we actually had a relative like that. You and your group can share your thoughts about that. What do you picture when you think of someone who's holy? Then you can say something like, today in our lesson from Leviticus 26, we'll see what the Bible tells us it means to live a holy life and the benefits that come from it. Context, we're wrapping up today our 3-week study in the Old Testament book of Leviticus. We've seen the book of Leviticus, far from being a boring book of arcane laws, is actually the central focus of the law, with 2 books before it and 2 after it, with the Day of Atonement right at its very center in chapter 16. Is the focus both of this book and of the whole Mosaic law. It teaches us that the atonement is necessary for us to draw near to the presence of God, which we were made to be fulfilled by. And of course, it foreshadows the ultimate atonement that was made for us by Jesus at the cross. So now in the chapters following Leviticus 16, God gave the people more commandments. These commandments flow now from the Day of Atonement. Because they had the atonement, Israel is now to do the things that God commanded. God gave them standards on what are immoral relationships in chapter 18, or what is idolatry in chapter 19, and various other laws in the next chapters. How we're to live because of the atonement. So now we come to the lesson this week in Leviticus 26 on holy living. God's people who've been redeemed by the atonement are to live holy lives, keeping his commandments and receiving great blessings for that obedience, as we will see in our verses for this week. For an outline, you might do something like this. Point 1, the commands of holiness in verses 1 and 2. Point 2, the blessings of holiness in verses 3 through 10. And then point 3, the ultimate blessing of holiness found in verses 11 and 12. Let's get into this great text, Leviticus 26, 1 through 13. Point number 1, the commands of holiness we see in verses 1 and 2. It says, you shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. From the New American Standard Bible, 1995. God wanted his people, Israel, to be a special kind of people, different from all the nations around them. It's the very definition of the word holy. It means to be set apart, to be distinct. God does not want his people to be like the world around them. He wants them to be holy, different. The differences he wanted to see in them were expressed in the commandments in the Old Testament. Some of those are included in our focus passage for today. For example, in verse 1, God tells them in several different ways they're not to worship idols. He says not to make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar. It's common in ancient times to do that. King Nebuchadnezzar, remember, set up a big pillar for everyone to bow down to. Nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to. So in 3 different ways here in verse 1, God commands them not to worship idols or images. It was very common in their world. Everybody worshiped images, but God's people were to be different. They were to be holy, and one way that they were to be holy was not to worship idols, images, and pillars. Then he gives some more commandments in verse 2. He says, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. So 2 more ways he wanted his people to be different from the world around them are seen here in verse 2. His people were to keep the Sabbath as his holy day. The nations around them would not, but his people were to show their difference by keeping that day. And again, they were to show the difference of holiness by revering his sanctuary, the tabernacle that he commanded to be built. And why does this text say his people were to do this? He says it again here at the end of verse 2. I am Yahweh. Remember, whenever we see Lord in all 4 capitals in the Old Testament, it means that in the Hebrew text, this is not the Hebrew word Adonai or Lord, but Yahweh, the personal name of God. I am that I am. Yahweh is the one, the Bible tells us, who made the heavens and the earth. Yahweh is the one who called Abram to be the father of a new nation. Yahweh is the one who redeemed Israel and brought them out of Egypt. Yahweh is the one who fed Israel with manna from heaven. He's their Lord, their God, their Savior, their deliverer, their provider. They're to obey these commands because he is Yahweh. God's people were to demonstrate that they were different, distinct from all the nations around them, and that they were followers of Yahweh because they kept these commandments. This is the way they would show that they were his. In fact, God told his people repeatedly in the book of Leviticus that the reason he wanted them to be holy is because he is holy. Our holiness is to reflect the fact that we belong to him. Now, one thing you might do is consider having different ones from your group read these next verses. You might pass them out in advance on slips of paper for them to read, or either that or post them on a screen on the board and you can read them. But notice the repetition in these verses. Leviticus 11:44a, for I am the Lord, Yahweh your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am holy. Leviticus 11:45, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. Leviticus 19:2, speak to all the congregation of the sons of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Leviticus 20:7, you shall consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am the Lord Yahweh your God. So that was their motivation. They were to be holy, expressing the fact that they belong to him and he is holy. And folks, this motivation has not changed. Even in the New Testament, we are to obey the Lord because of who he is. We're to demonstrate that we belong to him by the way we keep his commandments. Peter quotes this very command in his first letter, saying, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. It's 1 Peter 1:15 and 16. Jesus said in John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. He said in Luke 6:26, why do you call me Lord, Lord, but do not do what I say? 1 John 2 verses 3 and 4 says, by this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. The one who says, I've come to know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. So the New Testament repeatedly emphasizes that God's people are still to be holy because he is holy. And the expression of holiness, what it means to be holy, is to obey his commandments. There have always been those who think that Christians don't need to submit to the commandments of God. That is a false outlook, a false teaching. Holiness does not ignore the commands of God. Holiness obeys the commands of God, as Jesus himself, the epistles in the New Testament make very clear. Like Israel, our obedience to God's command should be the identifying mark that we belong to him. An illustration, you can share something that has happened multiple times, I know, in our lives, and likely in yours too. We were at a church fellowship one time, and kids of all ages were running around everywhere, laughing and playing. In the midst of all that chaos, I hollered out to my kids, Paul, David, Libby, stop running. Well, all of a sudden, you see three kids stop running. Well, which of all those kids out there were my children? They're the ones who obeyed my command. Our children hear our voice, and they do what we tell them to, if we're good parents and they're good children. And you can share that story if you want, or you may have a similar one like that you can share. But the point is, isn't this true in the spiritual realm as well? Of all the multitudes of people running to and fro in all the chaos of this world, which are the ones who are truly the children of God? Many people claim to be. Those who are truly his children show it by hearing his voice and obeying his commands. If you didn't use this John Newton quote a couple of weeks ago, you could share it this week because it really makes this point. Writing to Mrs. Wilberforce, who had asked him what were the signs of genuine conversion, Newton wrote, the best mark to judge by, which he has given us for that purpose, is to inquire if his word and will have a prevailing, governing influence upon our lives and temper. If we love him, we do endeavor to keep his commandments. And we'll hold the other way. If we have a desire to please him, we undoubtedly love him. Obedience is the best test. It's from John Newton, writing to Mrs. Wilberforce from the book Letters of John Newton, Josiah Bull editor, page 75. That quote's a great one, though. If you didn't use it a couple of weeks ago, use it this week. Post it up on your wall or on your video screen. Obedience is the best test. And you might discuss that with your class. Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. That principle has not changed since the time of Leviticus. God's people demonstrate that we are truly his by being holy, by being different from the world. You shall be holy, for I am holy. And God shows us how he wants us to be holy and different by giving us his commandments. We show that we're really his when we keep them. Now, you are going to want to emphasize, we are not saved by keeping God's commandments. We all fall short, and not one of us could be saved that way. Remind your group, we're only saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, like Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 says. But the best sign that we have been saved by grace through faith is our obedience to God's commands. God's commandments show us how we're to be holy, and they demonstrate that we are truly His. To help your group apply this point, you might ask them to discuss, what are some of the commandments we're to keep as God's people today that show that we are different from the world around us and that we belong to Him? Some answers might include being faithful to our husband or wife. This is increasingly uncommon, but it's a command God gives His people in both the Old and New Testaments. Exodus 20:14, 1 Thessalonians 4:3-6. Not cheating or stealing, getting away with whatever we can, again, found in both Testaments, Exodus 20:15 and Ephesians 4:28. Not taking revenge on our enemies, Matthew 5:38 and following, and Romans 12:19. Being submissive and respectful to governing authorities, Romans 13:1 and following. You and your group can think of many more, but emphasize to them that our obedience to God's commands, although they do not save us, they do demonstrate that we are His people, different from the world around us. We're to be holy because He is holy. And the way we demonstrate holiness is by keeping His commandments. So the commands of holiness. And point 2 then is the blessings of holiness. We see in verses 3-10. It says, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in their season, so that the land will yield its produce and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Indeed, your threshing will last for you until grape gathering, and your grape gathering will last until sowing time. You will thus eat your food to the full and live securely in your land. I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. I shall also eliminate harmful beasts from the land, and no sword will pass through your land. You will chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by the sword. 5 of you will chase 100, 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword. So I will turn toward you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I'll confirm my covenant with you. You'll eat the old supply and clear out the old because of the new. You know, we often picture obeying God's commandments as some difficult, dreary kind of thing, but God made some amazing promises to His people here in Leviticus 26 about the blessings of the holy life, the life of obedience. I might ask your group, but as you survey this passage, just call out for us, and maybe you write on the board while they're calling them out, all the blessings of obedience that they see here in verses 3-10. Answers should include verse 4, rains in their season, verses 4 and 5, extended seasons of harvest, grape gathering will last until sowing time, verses 5 and 6, they'll live securely in your land, verse 6, peace in the land, lie down with no one making you tremble, verse 6b, I will eliminate harmful beasts from the land, verses 7 and 8, victory over enemies, you'll chase your enemies, 5 of you will chase 100, and so on. Verse 9, make you fruitful, multiply you. Verse 10, you'll clear out the old because of the new, all these things. And you might ask your group, after you've talked about all of those, what is the condition God gives for these blessings that we see in this passage? Of course, it's found in verse 3. He says, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commands so as to carry them out. Verse 4, then He will do all this. So it's the if, then. It's cause and effect. If you do this, then I will do that, God says. He says, I will give you these blessings if you will be holy by obeying me the way that I command. And you might point out to your group, should we at least consider that the lack of some of these blessings in our lives or in our country today come from a lack of obedience to God's commands, like those that He gives us here? I think it's certainly worth our consideration. In Scripture, we see people humbling themselves and repenting when they don't get rain and so on. Has God changed? Does He not pour out blessings today on His people who obey Him? Maybe we bought in too much to the naturalistic view, that the weather and all these other blessings are just impersonal, natural things that happen no matter what we do. That is not a biblical viewpoint. Matthew 5:45 says, God is the one who sends rain on righteous and unrighteous. He's the giver of these blessings. And He does it, Leviticus 26 says, to those who obey His commandments. So God is teaching His people here in Leviticus the principle that there are blessings that will come to us if we obey Him. But listen, like most of the things in the Old Testament, there is a greater, more spiritual New Testament fulfillment. Under Christ, does God give His people great blessings for being holy and obeying Him? Absolutely. But are these all material blessings? Absolutely not. Many of the blessings God promises us in Christ are spiritual blessings. They are eternal blessings, not merely temporal, material ones. You might consider sharing this illustration from Agatha Christie's biography. She wrote, when my brother was invalided home from East Africa, he brought with him a native servant, Shabani. Anxious to show the simple African the glories of London, my brother hired a car and, sitting in it with Shabani, drove all around London. He displayed to him Westminster Abbey, Buckingham Palace, the Houses of Parliament, the Guildhall, Hyde Park, and so on. Finally, when they had arrived home, he said to Shabani, "What did you think of London?" Shabani rolled his eyes up. "It is wonderful, Bwana, a wonderful place. Never did I think I would see anything like it." She said. My brother nodded a satisfied head. "And what impressed you the most?" he said. The answer came without a moment's thought. "Oh, Bwana, shops full of meat. Such wonderful shops, meat hanging in great joints all over, and nobody steals them. Nobody rushes and pushes their way there and snatches. No, they pass by them in an orderly fashion. How rich and how great a country must be to have all this meat hanging in shops open to the streets. Yes, indeed, England is a wonderful place. Well, London is a wonderful city." It's from Agatha Christie's autobiography, page 64. So Shabani passed all the great halls of democracy, parliament. Here they are in the home of Magna Carta, the freedoms of citizens, of justice. But he was captivated by all the meat. There were greater blessings in England than that. But aren't we often that way as God's people? We focus on whether we have certain material blessings when we have all these rich spiritual blessings that come to us as we obey Christ. We should focus more on those spiritual blessings. And so you might ask your group at this point, what are some of the New Testament blessings God promises if we obey him? See these temporal blessings in the Old Testament. What does he promise us in the New Testament? Jesus said in John 15:10, "If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love." One great New Testament reward for keeping God's commandments is we experience his love in a close daily way. Jesus said in Matthew 5:44 and 45, "Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven." So if we treat our enemies the way he commands, we'll know and be known to the world as his children. What a great blessing. James 4 says, "Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he'll exalt you." So if we obey him by humbling ourselves, he will bless us by lifting us up. Many, many others like this. You and your group can think of others. There are many such promises for the blessings of obedience all through the New Testament. But the point here is God began to teach his people in Leviticus that there are great blessings that will come to us if we are holy and obey him. In Christ, in the New Testament, we see that there are greater, even more spiritual blessings for us if we do. And point 3, the ultimate blessing of holiness, found in verses 11 and 12. So verse 11 says, "Moreover, I will make my dwelling among you. My soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. I am the Lord, Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you would not be their slaves. And I broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect." I've set this blessing apart from the others in a separate point because it is by far the greatest and most important, the ultimate blessing of holiness. It is that holiness allows us to be near to God. Notice how that's expressed in verses 11 and 12. He says in verse 11, "I will make my dwelling among you." He says in verse 12, "I will also walk among you and be your God." The ultimate blessing of holy obedience is that God himself will make his dwelling among us. He will walk among us. The word the New Testament, the New American Standard Bible, translates dwelling here is the Hebrew mishkan, which comes from the word shakan, which means to dwell or to settle. It's often used of the tabernacle. So you might translate it dwelling, or you might translate it tabernacle. But the important thing about this is God would be among them. He'll make his tabernacle. He'll make his dwelling among them. And as we've seen over the last weeks, God dwelling with us is the greatest blessing there is. This is John Milton's classic Paradise Lost reversed. This is paradise restored. It's Eden regained. In the Garden of Eden, God walked with Adam in the cool of the day, but sin destroyed that fellowship and separated man from God's presence and glory. Like Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But now, through the atonement that Leviticus 16 taught, last week's lesson, man can begin to experience the presence of God walking with them again. Israel began to experience that with the tabernacle, and we experience it more fully when Jesus walked among us here on earth. And through his ultimate atonement at the cross, we can experience it perfectly at the end. As Revelation 21:3 says, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them." The word dwell there in Revelation 21:3 is literally tabernacle. God will tabernacle among us. That's the ultimate blessing of holy obedience. It allows us to be near to God. Think of Psalm 73:28. It says, "The nearness of God is my good." The nearness of God is by far the greatest blessing of all. Listen, you might emphasize this to your class. The great blessing of heaven that we ought to look forward to is not pearly gates or streets of gold or seeing David or Abraham or any of the other saints or relatives. The great blessing of heaven will be that God is near to us. He is the ultimate blessing. David McCullough writes in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Harry Truman that in his retirement, quote, "Truman loved his presidential library office, a bright, spacious room with books and sliding glass panels that opened onto a private patio and garden. His desk was some big mahogany desk he had used in the upstairs study at the White House. He was there nearly every day, Sunday included, except when he was traveling. As was often said, the most interesting item on display at the Truman Library was Truman himself." It's from David McCullough's Harry Truman, page 966. And it's the same thing with heaven. By far the most interesting, glorious, satisfying thing about heaven is just God himself and the Lamb, Jesus Christ. That's our hope and anticipation and glory. But remember, Hebrews 12:14 commands us pursue peace with all men and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. As you may know, another word for sanctification is holiness. Holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. If we want to see God, we must be holy. Our great motivation for holiness is that we want to be closer to God. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," Jesus said in Matthew 5:8. We don't want our sin to allow any cloud to come between us and God and separate us from him. We want uninterrupted fellowship with him. Leviticus continually repeats this refrain: "You shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy." The great blessing of holiness is the nearness of God that it brings to us. So our greatest motivation for holiness is not that it will make us rich or prosperous or healthy or anything else, but that our holiness will draw us closer to him who is holy. I myself believe that the rewards of heaven that we look forward to one day is not some large tract of land or a golf course or the perfect horse or any other material thing. Rather, the reward we'll experience will be a larger capacity to see and appreciate the glory of God. The more holy, the more obedient we are to him, the greater capacity we will have to love him and appreciate him and experience his glory forever. That is God's people's greatest motivation for holiness. So let's be holy. Let's obey God's command so that we'll be as close to him and know him and be as fulfilled by him as we possibly can. God himself is the goal of holy living. Well, I hope there's something in this lesson that you'll be able to plug into your lesson for your group on Sunday. Next time, we're going to start a new study for next quarter on 1st and 2nd Peter, some great New Testament books with lots of application for us as Christians as we try to live the Christian life. I hope we'll see you next week. Remember, if you'd like to read or print out a text version of this overview, to print out this lesson to use or use one of the quotes or stories, you can get that on my blog at www.shawnthomas.com, and I'll post that address in the comment section below. If you'll hit subscribe to this video on YouTube, the little bell, I think there, YouTube will automatically send you next week's video. You won't have to search for it. And if you write anything in the comment section below, I'll be sure to pray for you and for your group by name this week. Thank you for all the prayers for Cheryl and I as we transition into retirement. We're living in temporary housing now. We're waiting to close on a house here in Norman, Oklahoma in just a few weeks. So please continue your prayers for us in this time as well. Per my licensing agreement with Lifeway, these weekly lessons are based on content from Explore the Bible Adult Resources. The presentation is my own. It has not been reviewed by Lifeway. Lifeway resources are available at goexplorethebible.com and goexplorethebible.com/adults-training. And if you have questions about Explore the Bible resources, you can send emails to explorethebible@lifeway.com.